안녕하십니까. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to speak to you about the International Vaccine Institute and to talk about the International Vaccine Institute's role in a future pandemic. The mission of the International Vaccine Institute, which is the first international organization to be headquartered in Korea, is to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health. The International Vaccine Institute has 39 state parties and WHO as members, and today is holding its first ever Global Council meeting of its member states. What does the International Vaccine Institute do? You can break the activities of the Institute into three major pieces. The first is vaccine development, the development of these new vaccines, some of which cannot be developed by larger companies because the diseases they work on don't exist in high-income countries. But as an organization that receives development assistance, we also have to be committed to developing human and technical capacity in the countries where we work, which means training people on the ground in low and middle income countries, which would mean, in this case, transferring the capacity to manufacture oral cholera vaccine to a South African company called BioVac. We've been successful so far, and if we complete this technology transfer, it will be the first vaccine made from end to end by BioVac in South Africa. But ultimately, IVI has to show that we have impact. And to do that, we do a large number of assessments of the effectiveness of vaccines and, more importantly, the cost effectiveness of vaccines. Because in countries that are not necessarily Korea, being able to convince a Ministry of Finance that it is cost effective to implement vaccination programs is a major achievement and allows the vaccine then to be purchased and used by ministries of health. So as IVI, we work on end-to-end development from innovation, that is discovery, to impact. So this map gives you an idea of where in the world the International Vaccine Institute works. You can see our headquarters here in South Korea. We have an official regional office supported by the Swedish government in Stockholm, and soon will have opened a country office in Vienna, Austria, again with support from the Austrian government. In addition, we have what we call collaborating centers in 3 countries in Africa, here in Ghana, here in Ethiopia, and here in Madagascar. And these markers indicate where in the world International Vaccine Institute works. You can see there are over 44 sites scattered throughout the world, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and in the Pacific. And although this slide will be difficult to explain completely, the activities of IVI will look like any small biotech company, working here in the laboratory to discover new vaccines, here in the clinic to test those vaccines in humans, here under delivery to see whether these vaccines are cost-effective and can be used around the world. But in addition, we work on some vaccines in order to improve their use, to generate new data about whether these vaccines are cost-effective or if there are better ways to use them. And here is something you won't find in a company. We do a lot of epidemiology and surveillance. Why? Because the diseases that IVI works on are poverty-associated. They're found in low and middle-income countries. And often, for these diseases, we don't know the burden, the global burden of disease. And so generating that information allows us to go to funders, the Korean government, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and others to request funding to develop a vaccine. So epidemiology and surveillance is a fundamental part of what we do because it justifies the work that we do. And if, again, we were a company, this area in gray would be our vaccine pipeline. These are vaccines being tested in animals. If they succeed, then they will be moved to testing in humans, and these are some of the diseases. The vaccines that we are now in official testing in humans, and these are vaccines that have been approved, but for which we are trying to generate more data or improve the use of the vaccine. So this is also a complicated slide, but I think the key message here is that IVI acts on need and focuses on impact. So there was a need for a cholera vaccine. We worked in the laboratory to develop a vaccine and transferred the ability to manufacture it to a vaccine manufacturer here in Korea. And with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we went through manufacturing. We worked with U-Biologics to do clinical development, to get the approval from the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety, and ultimately to have WHO approve the vaccine or pre-qualify it. And at the same time then, for many vaccines, like the cholera vaccine, simply having the vaccine is not sufficient to get countries to use it. And then we have to work on the demand side of the equation, working with the World Health Organization, with the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and national immunization committees in order to have the vaccine taken up and used. And this emphasizes that a vaccine itself does not save lives. Vaccination saves lives. So in order for the vaccine to have impact, we have to have them used, and it's only then that we see the benefit of vaccination. These are the vaccines that IVI has developed from its laboratory through approvals. The first vaccine is oral cholera vaccine. And I think during the pandemic, many of us heard that it cost $500 million to $1 billion to develop a vaccine. The oral cholera vaccine cost the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation $28 million to develop, from the laboratory all the way through pre-qualification. Our second vaccine, again, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has just been approved by the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety and by the regulatory authority in Indonesia. And the third vaccine against non-typhoidal salmonella is still in preclinical development, with hopefully testing in humans to begin late next year. In addition, IVI participates in a significant number of training programs. In all, over 5,000 individuals, primarily from low and middle income countries, but also from Korea, have participated in training activities run by IVI. GTHB is in particular a new program funded by the Ministry of Health and Welfare of Korea with a collaborator at the World Health Organization, and it is providing practical training in the classroom for biomanufacturing, but also hands-on training. And the first hands-on training in a manufacturing facility in Korea will begin for individuals from Africa next month, and in December, a second group of individuals from Latin America also learning hands-on manufacturing training here in Korea. And this has a benefit for Korean industry, because as organizations in countries in Brazil and South Africa and elsewhere in Africa are in discussion with Korean companies like SK Bioscience or Samsung Bioepis or U-Biologics, the training that is provided by IVI through the Ministry of Health and Welfare allows Korean products and Korean industry to be globalized. And the other thing to highlight here is technology transfer, because one of the reasons the Korean government agreed to fund IVI was the idea that vaccine technology should not be the exclusive knowledge reserved for high-income countries, but should be something that is spread throughout the world. And this is some of the work done by the Global Training Hub in Biomanufacturing, again, co-sponsored by the Ministry of Health and Welfare and the World Health Organization and run by IVI. A final aspect is, we talk about pandemics and we think about the COVID pandemic or pandemic influenza, but there is a coming pandemic that no one really talks about, and this is the emergence of significant amount of resistance to standard treatments for bacterial disease, what we call antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. A very influential report from the United Kingdom hypothesized that if we do nothing to prevent antimicrobial resistance, it will cost the world $50 trillion and 10 million lives a year. And what can vaccines do? What you see here is the date of introduction of different antibiotics or antimicrobials that kill bacteria, and the X indicates when resistance emerges. And you can see that even for penicillin, the time between introduction and development of resistance was very short. On the bottom panel, you see that for vaccines, you don't get resistance. So vaccines may stop outbreaks caused by resistant bacteria, and there was a recent example of highly resistant salmonella infections in Pakistan, and that was an outbreak that could only be stopped by vaccination. So transitioning then from IVI to how IVI can help during pandemics, we have something called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And CEPI has proposed, after the COVID pandemic, that the next response, from the time the pathogen is announced to the time a vaccine is emergency use approved, should be 100 days. People think that 100 days is impossible, but it is a very useful target. And remember that during COVID, no one thought we would be able to develop a vaccine in 300 days, yet we did. And the question is, how would we in the future prepare to develop a vaccine in 100 days? So a useful way to think about this is to use an acronym, Force de Frappe, which in French means a strike force. And FRAP is the acronym that will explain how a 100-day vaccine might be possible. So the F is for funding. We need to have funding to develop a vaccine quickly. The R is for regulatory. That is, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety or other regulatory agencies need to be ready for very fast approvals of protocols and vaccines. And the third, the A, is assessment. We have to be able to assess those vaccines. We have to be able to diagnose the disease. We have to be able to work very quickly in the laboratory and execute and analyze clinical trials. The first P is for platforms, and this would be something like mRNA vaccines that can be rapidly adapted to other pathogens, other bacteria or viruses, and at the same time have a very rapid turnaround time. The second P is for participation or participatory practice. Why? Because we need to be able to test the vaccine very rapidly in populations. So we can't have long delays between the initiation of a study and completion of enrollment of volunteers in that study. And to do that, it means that the community needs to be prepared and understand why it's important to test the vaccine quickly. The last letter is E for ethics. And this is because vaccines are medical treatments given to prevent disease. They're given to healthy people. And in order to conduct a study, we have to make sure that the studies are conducted to the highest of ethical standards. And this means that the institutional review boards, what we call ethical committees that review all medical protocols, have to be ready also to review things quickly. So this gets to funding. And in order to obtain significant funding, billions of dollars, you need leadership. The World Bank created something called the Pandemic Fund. In the beginning, we thought we needed about $10 billion. The World Bank now estimates that it might be $15 billion. How much money has been collected? $2 billion. So we were already starting to forget one of the key lessons from the COVID pandemic. At the same time, the World Health Organization began high-level discussions around a pandemic treaty, something that would help us to adjust very quickly to the next pandemic. However, as the treaty evolved, it became progressively weaker because countries are reluctant to give up autonomy in order to control pandemics. So in the Korean response to COVID, we knew exactly who was in charge, who was responsible, who was held accountable. For the world, we have no idea who's in charge, and that may be a problem in terms of coordinating responses. At the same time, regulators have to become faster. So as they say, regulating smarter and safer, not slower. Often in my previous work, when we were submitting things to the Food and Drug Administration, it would be months before we could have an official meeting or approval. During the pandemic, we don't have months, we have days. So Ministry of Food and Drug Safety, the Food and Drug Administration, and others have to find ways to do what we call concurrent reviews. That is, reviewing data as it's coming in so that we will have real-time evidence of efficacy and will be able to make recommendations quickly. So before COVID, we would say that it takes 5 to 10 years to develop a vaccine. During COVID, it was possible to develop a vaccine in 11 months. And what we're saying now is with the 100-day proposal that we would like to decrease that amount of time from 300 days to 100 days. At the same time, we have to be able to assess the efficacy of the vaccine or to determine whether the vaccine works, which means that we have to do a lot of thinking about what the vaccine should do in human populations when it's tested. And we also have to have a good idea of the dose and schedule, whether or not there's a laboratory test that we can use instead of watching people get sick, whether or not we can use a placebo or an inactive substance. All of these things have to be worked out before we actually begin if we want to achieve efficiency. And with regard to platforms, a platform is something that we think will work, but not all platforms give us the best responses. So for instance, although the Moderna mRNA vaccine for COVID was safe and highly efficacious, when Moderna did the same thing for influenza recently, it didn't work as well. So in a sense, a platform is like a leap of faith, and turning a platform into a vaccine is turning a concept into reality. And every now and then, our assumptions don't work. So this is a very well-known and very competent American contract manufacturer, Emergent. And during the COVID pandemic, there were problems in the manufacturing plant, which was actually reserved by the US government specifically for pandemic preparedness. So just because we have plans and platforms doesn't necessarily mean that everything will go as planned. Participation. We can't test a vaccine unless there are volunteers who are ready and willing to participate in the vaccine trials. And so what we call good participatory practices is something that we have to put into effect before the pandemic as a part of pandemic preparedness so that people who will participate in the trial are able to understand what it is we're doing and why it's so important to enroll people quickly. Ethics, the final component. Ethical conduct of trials is critical, and unethical conduct of trials diminishes the value of the trial and also creates problems in communication with the communities where the vaccine needs to be tested. So this includes education around emerging diseases and a lot of preparatory work creating the scientific, clinical trial, and ethical capacity in potential sites. So if we were looking at a disease, and I'm picking one called Lassa fever, which exists in West Africa and causes a significant number of infections, it means that we have to start educating communities about that and prepare them for potential clinical trials in the future. And this is something that countries haven't emphasized as much as they could. But when a low and middle income country participates in a vaccine trial to test the vaccine efficacy, they should negotiate something called an access agreement, which allows the population in that country, which was subjected to the risk and participated in phase 3 trials, to have access to the vaccine after the vaccine is shown to be safe and efficacious. And you'd think that this makes common sense, but there's a very good example of Thailand where they tested a hepatitis A vaccine in 40,000 Thai children. The vaccine was highly efficacious. Thailand could not afford to buy the vaccine afterwards, and it created a movement to make access agreements a critical part of any trials done in Thailand. And so this is the last slide, but I think it's just a reminder. As COVID-19 is fading in our memory, and the world is confronted with Ukraine and what's happening in the Gaza Strip and in Israel, pandemics aren't our only problem. But I think the important point here is that global health is linked to humanity's other great challenges. So we have challenges that are facing society around human rights, around equity and justice within societies. We have challenges for the planet. It includes things like antimicrobial resistance, climate change, biosphere diversity, and pollution. And then think about the increase in human population and the pressures that human population put on all the other problems in society. Think about scarcity, again, related to population, scarcity of food resources, scarcity of water, scarcity of natural resources. and conflicts. And again, just quickly thinking about Ukraine and the Gaza Strip, but there are other conflicts going on around the world. And all of these, as you might guess, interact with each other. Global health intersects all of them. And how is that? You can see the pressure or the pressures of development and the desire for farmland and wood in the deforestation of the Amazon. So that's an interaction between society and planet. We can see the pressures that population put on the planet in terms of transmission of what we call zoonotic diseases, diseases that go from animals to humans, and COVID is an example of that. And here, a large population, a shortage of water led to a shortage of food, so drought and famine. That caused large external and internal displacements of refugees. And in these refugee camps in Somalia in 2011, we first had a cholera outbreak and then a huge measles outbreak that sickened thousands and killed thousands of people. And we don't have to look, we were just in Rwanda last week. And this is a reminder of the genocide in Rwanda that caused, again, mass displacement of populations into neighboring Zaire, and then a huge, one of the largest cholera outbreaks in memory, and thousands of deaths in Goma in 1994. And then, of course, the societal problems and conflicts and the planet. These are protests in Europe, in Italy in 2021, protesting against the green cards, which were the card that proved that you were vaccinated. And this anti-vaxxer, vaccine hesitancy movement is causing significant problems because it's tied in to a group of people who are now rejecting science as well. And as we think about the things that we need to do globally or as societies, it's to improve scientific literacy, to help people to understand why the things we're saying are true and why we need to do things for global health. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at the Sejongno State Forum. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to present global health pandemics and preparing for the next pandemic. Thank you. 감사합니다.